Thank you. My name is Robert Coulter. I'm the delegate of my nation, the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and I want to say a few words to add to what's been said already. My nation is one of more than 120 Indian nations that have submitted 4 recommendations for inclusion in the outcome document. One of them is the recommendation that the World Conference decide to create a distinct and appropriate status for Indigenous peoples within the UN system in order that Indigenous peoples can participate effectively on a permanent basis. I just want to add that that single recommendation, that single action, is one that is a key to protecting and promoting practically all rights of Indigenous peoples. It's the key to addressing practically all issues involving Indigenous peoples. And so it's of particular importance, and I'm glad that practically all other Indigenous speakers have likewise recommended that. I also want to add a few words about the implementing body that has also been supported by many other speakers. I want to emphasize the need for it, the need for some kind of implementing body, because Indigenous peoples are so often vulnerable to fraud and misdealing, violence, theft of their resources, abuse, oppression of all kinds, because so often Indigenous peoples are economically marginalized, politically marginalized, and lacking in resources to gain access to legal remedies. So there's a particularly strong reason why an implementing body is needed. Now, we've heard in some situations that, well, there are already a lot of implementing bodies, and perhaps a new one isn't called for. But the reason that there are a lot of implementing bodies for human rights instruments is that they work. They are essential, they are important, and that's the way human rights are implemented, and I think we need one too. But then some ask, can't one of the existing bodies implement and monitor the compliance with the Declaration? Well, no, not as they're currently set up. None has the mandate to do that kind of work. The expert mechanism has been mentioned, and yes, that is a thought, and we don't rule it out, this possibility of restructuring and providing a new mandate for one of the existing mechanisms, such as the expert mechanism. But I can't help but observe that the difficulty of expanding the mandate and restructuring the method of selecting members of the expert mechanism in order that it can function properly and effectively as a monitoring and implementing body, that process might be more difficult than simply creating a body that is specifically designed to do this particular job in a good and economical way. But I think we should be open to all possibilities. My nation and the other nations that we're working with, we also support the idea of an optional protocol or a voluntary mechanism that has been proposed. I think all of these deserve consideration, and they need to be studied and action needs to be taken. But the World Conference needs to get this in the outcome document and make a decision that that process must go forward. We've also heard, and maybe you've heard as well, that an implementing body isn't really appropriate for a declaration. Implementing and monitoring bodies are appropriate for human rights treaties. Well, that's not actually the case. The UN has more than once created an implementing body for a declaration. The most important example of this is a very successful one, and that's the Special Committee on Decolonization that was created by the General Assembly to implement the 1960 Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. That was in 1960. Another example is more recent, and that's the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. Responsibility for implementing that declaration was given to the Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances in 1992. So there's plenty of precedent. I think there are other examples of this as well. So we should not be reluctant to have an implementing body for the declaration. Changing my point of view, let me make an observation, and I think it's a hopeful one, about the discussion today. What I've seen today is a reflection of a great deal of agreement about some basic ideas, some important ideas that many speakers have mentioned, that many bodies, Indian nations and caucuses and regional groups have recommended. What I have noticed, I would say, you may make your own list, but it seems to me the most widely supported ideas were these, the most widely supported recommendations for action. One was for the implementing body. That seems to be the principal mechanism for dealing with land rights issues as well. At least it's one of them. Another idea that was widely supported by practically all Indigenous speakers who mentioned it was the need to take action about violence against Indigenous women and girls. The other one is the recommendation that an appropriate and distinct observer status be created for Indigenous peoples in the United Nations system. Another area where there seems to be wide agreement is the need for the conference to call upon states to act at the national level, particularly about land issues, about sacred places, and about the question of violence against Native women and girls. And there seems to be also considerable agreement that it would be valuable to reaffirm the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I find it hopeful that there's that extent of agreement and common purpose among those who have spoken, and I'm pleased as well that states are willing to consider the question of an implementing and monitoring body in some form. And so with those observations, I thank you for this opportunity.